Excessive devotion to radical ideas often goes beyond common sense. People sometimes lose touch with reality, mistaking illusions for truth and trying to convince others of the same. It's even worse when someone falls victim to manipulation and begins to blindly believe in imposed convictions. Today we will learn about the tragic consequences that such misguided beliefs can lead to. Sweden is known for its low crime rate and is considered a safe country. Its territory is dotted with many small settlements, such as the tiny community of Knutby. This town is so miniature, with a population of about 700 people, that it has only one store, one restaurant, and a church, while the rest of the buildings are wooden houses of local residents scattered among the forests. It would seem that in such a small town, there is nowhere for evil to hide, but once upon a time, real monsters lived here, capable of committing 3 murders, the scale of which overshadows many world-renowned criminals. Helge Fossmo was born on July 27, 1971, in the village of Björnborg, another small settlement located in the central part of Sweden. Helge became one of 5 children in the family. It is known for certain that his parents were not religious people. Usually, those who aspire to devote themselves to faith come to it through the influence of their loved ones. But in this case, the boy's interest in the church arose independently. At the age of 12, he joined the youth group of the local religious community. His parents reacted calmly to this decision. They saw that the young man was genuinely passionate about this topic and did not interfere. In any case, in their opinion, it was not the worst choice for a teenager. Later, Helge claimed that it was at this moment that his life acquired true meaning. He spoke of some kind of salvation that he found in the church. Despite his young age, the boy stood out by becoming one of the most active members of the community, regularly attending gatherings and church events. This continued for 5 years until, in 1988, he got a job at a cafe for Christian youth. It was there that the hero of the story met his first love, a girl named Helen Johansson. The young people immediately felt a mutual attraction, their relationship developed rapidly, and as soon as both reached adulthood, the lovers got married. While the couple lived in Björnborg, they had 2 children. The hero of the story continued to delve into religious issues and became a preacher in the local community. All this lasted until a fateful meeting that took place in 1993. It was then that the man met a woman named Asa Waldau, who called herself the Bride of Christ. This new face was the leader of a Christian sect that intended to settle in the town. Asa herself came from Knutby, where her teachings had originally originated. She traveled from city to city, preaching and recruiting new followers. She was primarily interested in teenagers and young men and women. Therefore, Helge's family became an ideal target. Asa always used the same trick, convincing her future adherents to leave their homes and join their church. However, their first meeting was not very pleasant. When Asa first spoke with the devout Christian Helge, he reacted quite harshly and noted that he had never heard of a woman being a pastor. In addition, the philosophy of her teachings and interpretation of the Holy Scriptures seemed too radical to him. He was skeptical of her words, especially after realizing that she represented not just a religious movement, but a real sect. But Asa was not one to give up easily. She was interested in the Fossmo family and wanted to involve this couple in her ranks. However, she understood that she would have to act carefully and methodically. Over the next few years, the woman spent a lot of time gaining the trust of the young family and convincing them of the harmlessness of the community's activities. At the same time, she imposed her teachings, which increasingly fascinated Helge. It took almost 4 years, from 1993 to 1997, finally, Asa persuaded the young Fossmo couple to join her teachings and even move to Knutby. Initially, it was presented as an ordinary friendly visit. She showed what their church looked like from the inside and told in more detail about her work and the goals they pursued. Gradually, Asa increasingly captured the attention of her victims. She liked to point out the shortcomings of the traditional church, which eventually sowed a seed of doubt in the mind of our hero. And so they moved to Knutby, closer to Asa's church. In fact, the organization already had many followers, a significant part of the small town's community consisted of religious parishioners who were involved in various activities necessary to support the functioning of the church. In turn, it provided jobs for those in need. Almost all members of the community had their own responsibilities, and many of them were related specifically to religious activities. On the one hand, this formed a strong sense of unity. Everyone knew each other well, supported and protected one another. The residents of Knutby were truly close-knit people who gladly accepted the preacher and his young family into their ranks. Helge willingly took on the same role he had before moving, becoming the pastor of the new church. Quite quickly, unconventional motives began to be noticed in his sermons. He often spoke about taboo topics such as and death, and in rather dubious interpretations. Such a radical approach to interpreting the Holy Scriptures was not close to all parishioners, but despite this, Helge continued his mission. 2 years after moving, the Fossmo family had a third child. Because of this, the burden on everyone increased. Therefore, the parents decided to find a nanny. After a short search, they chose Sara Svensson, who had just moved to the town and was also inspired by Asa's work. Sara was raised in a Christian community, in a believing family. From childhood, she suffered from severe allergies and limitations, unable to live a normal life. All this time, Sara was cared for by her mother, with whom they became very close. Unfortunately, the woman died after a long illness when the girl was 11 years old. This event had a devastating impact on the child. She ran away from home, turning into a troubled teenager. After his wife's death, the burden of upbringing fell on Sara's father's shoulders. Despite the fact that the man devoted all his free time to his daughter, he could not be torn apart, as he worked a lot. They also formed a fairly close bond, but the man could not replace the mother. Sara stayed with her father until she accidentally met Asa during her pilgrimage to a neighboring city. This happened at a Bible study lesson. The two women quickly found common ground. The girl turned out to be an excellent candidate for recruitment, so it was not difficult for the preacher to find her weaknesses and skillfully use them to attract the younger generation to her ranks. Sara decided to move to Knutby to be closer to the church and comprehend the paths that the enlightened Asa spoke about. During this period, Helge became closer to Asa than ever before. They often spent time together, engaging not only in the Holy Scriptures. These two received some messages from above, which they interpreted as prophecies sent by God. The man kept quite detailed records of these events. It was a kind of diary in which he recounted in detail the sacred revelation, what he saw and felt, as well as the interpretation of these images. In one of them, it was said that God had called him the King of Kings and Asa the Queen of Heaven. According to the pastor of the church, he appeared in the world at the very moment of the creation of the universe. And since then, he had been waiting to meet an equally magnificent creature, which Asa was. The woman herself insisted that she had to marry him, and this would create a great union that would elevate their alternative faith to the highest heights. Helge unreservedly believed in all this. In 1999, they staged a kind of sacrament, which was essentially a wedding between Helge and Asa. The man gave her a ring with 7 diamonds. This number has a sacred meaning in many faiths. At that time, Helen still remained the pastor's official wife. Of course, what was happening made her very jealous. Against this background, problems began in the relationship. However, Asa intervened. She criticized the pastor's young wife for jealousy, calling this feeling the worst thing a true Christian woman can experience. Asa insisted that Helen should change her attitude, otherwise, the cult would find a way to create serious problems for her, even take away the house where the family lived. And Helen had to come to terms with it. The relationship between the cult leaders continued to develop in increasingly bizarre ways. Despite the fact that the preacher was still officially married, he practically did not care about his family and spent all his time in Asa's company. This became especially noticeable after the sacrament was performed. Asa actively showered him with love and praise. In this way, she evoked the pastor's affection, which became extremely powerful. The woman used all this not to build a marriage or even to quarrel the spouses, but simply to control Helge. Asa acted very subtly and effectively, so she quickly began to control almost every action of the man. She knew everything about him, which they engaged in constantly, became a powerful weapon for manipulation. At the same time, Asa convinced the pastor that he could literally channel Jesus through himself. All these absurd ideas accumulated like a snowball. The behavior of this extravagant couple became increasingly provocative and strange. Neither Helen, nor the children, nor other parishioners could influence what was happening. Given Asa's manipulative nature, all this could not end well. The tension was growing. In December 1999, a disease raged in the city. Helge and Helen also fell ill, so they stayed at home. The couple was bedridden, and most of the responsibilities fell on the nanny and housekeeper Sara, who miraculously did not get infected. Nevertheless, the Fossmo couple remained active, trying to engage in their usual affairs. On the morning of December 18, 1999, the couple was at home. The illness did not subside, so both were very weak. They had breakfast together, and then Helge decided to lie down and rest due to his malaise. The man fell asleep soundly and through his sleep heard a knock at the door. When he woke up, his wife was nowhere to be found. It turned out that a neighbor had come to check on the couple. The man had not heard anything from them all day and became worried. The head of the family opened the door, assuring that everything was fine, but the neighbor insisted on seeing Helen as well. She did not respond to calls, although she was supposed to stay at home. The woman was nowhere to be seen. But the husband remembered that she was going to take a shower. Helge noticed that she had been gone for too long. The men became worried and decided to check what was happening. Since Helen did not answer to her name, they dared to break the lock with a simple screwdriver. Opening the door, they found Helen floating face down in a filled bathtub. The lock was locked from the inside. The woman was still in the nightgown she had worn to breakfast in the morning. Helge screamed so loudly that it attracted several more neighbors to his house. Together, they pulled the body out of the water and tried to perform cardiopulmonary resuscitation. Unfortunately, it was too late. Helen was pronounced dead at the age of 27. During the investigation, a very serious head injury was found on the woman, which could well have been fatal. According to the forensic expert, the real cause of death could have been several factors at once. Obviously, the craniocerebral trauma obtained could have led to a loss of consciousness, causing the young mother to simply drown. Even more mystery was added to this incident by the toxicological expert report. An extremely high dose of was found in the blood of the deceased. According to calculations, this alone would have been enough to kill Helen. But the woman did not take any medications, so how could they end up in her system? It could have been murder, but nevertheless. Law enforcement officials concluded that the death was an accident. They assumed that the woman slipped, fell, and hit her head on the edge of the bathtub. A big role in shaping this version was played by the testimony of the housekeeper Sara, who confirmed the pastor's every word that Helen was alone and no one could have killed her. It seemed that the couple was in mourning and sincerely experiencing this loss, but those who knew the pastor more closely noticed some oddities in his behavior. In particular, he almost immediately got rid of all things related to his wife and no longer mentioned her. He even forbade the children to talk about their mother. Some believed that Helen's death was not an accident, but an unwanted wife was simply gotten rid of so as not to interfere. In addition, it was known that the man personally influenced the conclusion about the autopsy results. Initially, he asked not to perform an autopsy at all for religious reasons, but he was refused due to the suspicious nature of the death. Then the preacher insisted that the facts about overdose be excluded from the autopsy report. He justified this by saying that it was necessary to minimize the possibility that his wife voluntarily took her own life, as suicide is considered a sin for which his beloved Helen would not be able to go to heaven. He also attributed these suspicious actions to an unwillingness to dishonor the memory of his wife and family. Unexpectedly, during this period, Asa lost interest in the man. Their turbulent relationship ended when she went on another pilgrimage to the cities and decided not to return. Unfortunately, she had managed to thoroughly brainwash the pastor, who was determined to continue following the path of the sect. Despite the display of grief and tears, Helge very quickly found a new love. It turned out to be Asa's sister, named Alexandra Waldau. The relationship between the lovers developed rapidly, largely due to the pastor's status. By this time, many considered him a person close to God, treated him with great respect, which also won over Alexandra. In November 2000, she moved into the pastor's house, and soon the lovers got married. Despite the new marriage, the pastor's desire for romantic relationships only grew. It seemed that one woman was never enough for him. So already in November 2001, he began to actively flirt with the nanny of his children. At that time, Sara Svensson was still working in the pastor's house and readily accepted the signs of attention from such a respected person. Their relationship even received the blessing of the sect leader Asa Waldau. At this point, the relationship with Alexandra deteriorated, and the nanny, seeing all this, tried to support her lover so that he could solve all these problems. The man actively took advantage of Sara's vulnerability, often inviting her to pray together in the church. During such moments, he often inclined the girl to intimacy, of course, every time he insisted that all this had nothing to do with infidelity in marriage, but in this way, they were reuniting in a spiritual union and the pastor was conveying a message to God. By that time, Sara worshipped Helge so much that she gladly accepted all these stories as true. According to her confession, she even felt some kind of divine inspiration at such moments. Sara sincerely believed that she was doing good and a righteous deed, but in reality, she fell into the trap of a manipulator who wanted to use her, covering himself with spiritual values. His goals were as far from religion as possible. Sometime after the beginning of this relationship, the pastor began to voice increasingly controversial statements. At first, he started saying that the Lord was fighting his own battles on earth, and Helge was his warrior. He said that it was not an easy job, as sometimes various obstacles had to be removed from the path. The man spoke in riddles, and the naive Sara readily believed in all this because he was a pastor. The sermons were perceived as divine revelations. In reality, Helge was gradually probing the ground for the implementation of an insidious plan. Then he began to say that God had started sending him important messages during with his second wife. He interpreted them in such a way that Alexandra would soon have to leave this world. The man brainwashed Sara, convincing her that the Lord had shown him the ideal couple, which turned out to be her. In addition, he began to frighten the girl by claiming that she could die if the union with Alexandra was not broken. Helge's marriage was falling apart during this period, but as a pastor, he could not divorce due to strict rules. Like all the women who surrounded the preacher, Sara was enchanted by his stories. With these insane messages, he brainwashed even his own children, systematically pushing them to commit terrible acts. The manipulator managed to firmly tie the victim to himself, using his authority in the church and knowing Sara's vulnerabilities that he could press on. He learned many lessons of such control from Asa and now readily applied them. By this time, many seriously believed that he was the person closest to God, and against this background, it was not difficult for Helge to win the nanny over to his side. According to him, the girl had to help God fight demons, for which it was necessary for her to move into his house. Despite the fact that during this period he still lived with Alexandra, the women resided in different rooms, and every night Helge had sex with them in turn. Each time. All this was justified by the fight against demons. The pastor called intimacy a ritual for healing from impurity. His eloquence allowed him to convince the women that the pastor was a messenger from above and was fighting the enemies of the Lord in this way. The relationship in this format lasted until 2003, and Alexandra was still living in the preacher's house. Verbally, they broke up but could not officially divorce. The man wanted to get rid of her. During this period, the manipulation of Sara reached its apogee. As a rule, Helge addressed her only to have intercourse. At other times, he often insulted her, calling her a sinner, an arrogant blonde, but each time he ended the emotional execution with the phrase, "I love you." It got to the point where Sara was so happy to hear these last 3 words that she stopped paying attention to everything else. It seemed that she was ready to do anything just to feel the gratitude of a person close to God. A true fighter against demons. She did not even notice how, along with this, her will was completely suppressed. The girl turned into a puppet in the hands of a dangerous man. Against the backdrop of problems with his second wife, Helge repeatedly asked his mistress if she was ready to kill in the name of the Lord God. If earlier she hesitated with the answer, now she seemed to react more calmly and was more inclined to take his side. Sara replied that she was not ready, but the resistance this time was much weaker. Then the pastor decided to push her on the path of righteousness. Helge created a new account in the messenger and began to send Sara messages from an unknown number. He tried to convince her that it was the Lord God trying to contact her. These ominous correspondences told her that Sara did not have much time left. She had to kill in the name of God no later than November 25th. At first, she suspected that it was Helge sending her all these messages, but the man angrily denied his involvement. He again used the old method, accusing his mistress of insufficient faith and sins. Unfortunately, it worked one more time. Then the pastor began to send Sara messages that the girl should become part of God's plan, sending people's souls home to heaven. The so-called God claimed that for her, this was the only way to gain salvation. Eventually, all this led to a real fear for her soul and inclined Sara to crime. It went so far that on the night of November 8, 2003, Alexandra woke up in her own bed to Sara beating her with a hammer. The woman miraculously survived. Fighting off the nanny. The reason for the attack was a message that the attacker received from God through the messenger. He ordered her to wake up right now and kill the pastor's wife. Surprisingly, the criminal avoided punishment, probably because Helge insisted that the incident not be reported to the police. Indeed, there were no mentions of it in the police records. After the hammer incident, the pastor could think of nothing better than to send Sara to her father's house, supposedly as a punishment for her insolent behavior. As if the preacher was not involved in this attack and did not push the nanny to violence. However, this desperate attempt by Helge to hide the traces of his manipulation did not put an end to the eerie correspondence. The pseudo-divine subscriber incessantly bombarded the girl with messages, in which he again and again reminded her of the need for ritual killings. These messages not only called the nanny to crime, they fueled her obsession with the idea of saving her own soul through the shedding of someone else's blood. Unfortunately, Sara's banishment did not affect Helge's plans at all. The self-proclaimed messenger of the Lord had been without carnal pleasures for too long and hastened to find a new victim. Almost immediately after sending the nanny away, the preacher started another affair, this time with a neighbor named Annette Lind. It is noteworthy that at that time the woman was married to a man named Daniel. However, the pastor was not at all embarrassed by the presence of another contender for the attention of his mistress. In Helge's mind, another insidious plan was born. He simply decided to get rid of the rival by removing Daniel from the path. The pastor acted according to his usual scheme. He again began to send Sara disturbing messages on behalf of the Almighty. Blackmail and manipulation had the same effect as before. After all, the girl above all sought the salvation of her immortal soul. Under the influence of intimidation, she again agreed to take up arms. Helge's cynical plan worked flawlessly. The man managed to subdue the nanny's will and turn her into a complete puppet. Despite the unsuccessful first attempt to implement the insane plan, Sara got a chance to prove her devotion to the pastor's ideas. This time, her preparation for the ritual killing was much more thorough. The girl not only bought a pistol but also looked up special instructions on the internet for making a homemade silencer. She blindly obeyed Helge's instructions, hoping to serve the Lord and gain salvation. On the morning of January 10, 2014, the obsessed nanny got into her father's car and set off for Fossmo's house. Constantly maintaining contact with the preacher, Sara reached the desired area around 3 o'clock in the morning. By the way, at that time, 23-year-old Alexandra, Helge's new wife, was still living under the same roof with the pastor. Having parked the car half a kilometer from the crime scene, the girl began to prepare for the attack, carefully disguised, wearing shoes of different sizes to throw the police off. She also put on thick bags on top so as not to leave any traces. Entering Fossmo's house was not difficult. The front door turned out to be unlocked. It seemed to be part of the insidious plan. The preacher had broken the lock that night to stage a robbery. Soon the criminal was already standing in the bedroom next to the carelessly sleeping Alexandra. Sara did not even give the victim a chance to be saved. She cold-bloodedly shot the woman in the thigh. And when she opened her eyes in pain, finished her off with a shot to the head. However, Helge ordered his servant to get rid of not only his wife but also his main rival. So, around 4:30 in the morning, Sara went to the house of Annette Lind to kill her husband, Daniel. The pastor had found out in advance that his mistress had left her spouse alone at home that night. The criminal's plans were nearly thwarted. The door turned out to be locked. However, Sara did not lose her head and simply knocked. When the sleepy owner opened the door, she aimed at his chest without hesitation and pulled the trigger. The wounded Daniel fell, and the attacker added a control shot to the head. After that, Sara fled, not even suspecting that her second victim had miraculously survived. Literally bleeding, the man managed to reach for the phone and call an ambulance. When the medics and police arrived at the crime scene, he even retained consciousness, so he was able to describe the appearance of the attacker. Meanwhile, Helge himself was already waiting near the house of his wounded neighbor, demonstrating a sincere desire to help. The villain even went with Daniel to the hospital, where he allegedly first heard about the murder of his own wife, Alexandra. Of course, the preacher immediately played the role of an inconsolable widower. Unfortunately, Daniel's condition did not allow him to provide the police with a clear description of the criminal. After all, she was wearing a mask. However, the law enforcement officers did not even have time to declare the suspect wanted, as one of the neighbors recalled the strange circumstances of the death of Fossmo's first wife. The man was one of the few whose brains the pastor had not yet managed to wash, so his testimony immediately alarmed the investigators. Hence, the story surfaced of how, a year before, Sara had nearly killed Helge's second wife by attacking Alexandra with a hammer. It turned out that the nanny had committed attempts on the lives of the pastor's women before. The last straw for the police were Sara's bloody fingerprints found at the scene of Alexandra's murder and on the door of Daniel's house. The evidence of the girl's involvement in both crimes was simply irrefutable. The nanny was arrested on suspicion of murder and attempted murder. At first, the girl behaved exactly as programmed. She refused to admit her guilt and insisted that she acted alone, guided by mystical revelations. Only later did she let slip that she was simply carrying out the will of the Lord. Upon examining Sara's mobile phone, the investigators found Helge's contact there and some unknown number. Interestingly, no traces of correspondence with God were preserved in the phone's memory. However, the analysis of incoming and outgoing calls exposed the connection between the nanny and the pastor. But the case really moved from a dead point only when, during a thorough search in the Svensson house, the operatives came across another of the girl's mobile phones, the same one that had previously been used for secret correspondence. It was there that the spicy correspondence with the Almighty was stored. In more than 1,000 text messages, there were direct calls for violence and detailed instructions for ritual killings. This correspondence not only compromised Sara's unknown interlocutor, it exposed the entire vile depth of his moral decay and insidious manipulations aimed at turning the nanny into a mindless instrument of crime. The correspondence covered more than 1,000 messages in which an unknown subscriber incited Sara to brutal murders. Tracking the mysterious number was not difficult for experienced specialists. As expected, all digital traces led to the local pastor, Helge Fossmo. When Sara was told this news, she felt a bitter disappointment. After all, the girl so sincerely believed in the divine nature of the mysterious dialogue. Upon learning the truth, the nanny no longer covered for her idol and told the investigators everything. Even Annette, the new passion of the preacher and the wife of the wounded Daniel, was detained on suspicion of complicity in the crimes. However, 2 weeks later, the woman was released without charges. The investigation obtained irrefutable evidence of her non-involvement in the bloody events, but Helge remained defiant until the very end. Throughout the entire trial, he denied his guilt and did not even think about repenting. A mandatory psychiatric examination found the pastor fully sane and able to stand trial. The scale of Fossmo's manipulations was simply staggering. He turned the nanny into a real killing machine. The prosecution had enough evidence at its disposal to find Helge guilty of inciting the murder of his second wife Alexandra, as well as the attempted murder of Daniel, the husband of his new mistress. In July 2004, the pastor finally stood trial. The criminal was sentenced to life imprisonment without the right to early release for 24 years. All further appeals of the murderer were rejected. Interestingly, only in 2008 did Helge nearly get out of prison. It was all because the prosecution tried to reopen the case of the death of his first wife. But in the end, the prosecutors withdrew due to a lack of direct evidence of murder. However, law enforcement agencies are still convinced that Fossmo could have been involved in this death. Even while behind bars, the pastor managed to get married for the third time, right from his prison cell. The name of his new chosen one remains a secret to the general public. During an interview in August 2006, Fossmo unexpectedly confessed to his role in the death of Alexandra and the attempt on Daniel's life. Moreover, he hinted at the involvement of several other people in the organization of the murders. Unfortunately, the police never reopened the investigation. As of today, 51-year-old Helge Fossmo is serving a life sentence in the Swedish maximum security prison Tidaholm. The court case file contains a video recording of the investigative experiment, during which Sara Svensson recreated in detail all the circumstances of the crime she committed. Later, an independent investigation revealed that an edited version of this tape was shown at the hearing. The original 6-hour recording accidentally fell into the hands of journalists. It turned out that Sara's detailed reconstruction of events did not coincide with the objective data of the investigation. For some reason, the girl distorted the circumstances of her own crime even in later interviews. Naturally, this gave rise to a lot of questions and suspicions about the real sequence of tragic events. Some vigilant observers suggested that the murders could have been committed by Fossmo himself, who then masterfully shifted the blame onto Sara. So the girl was sent for a psychiatric examination, and later the court found her insane. However, this did not save Svensson from compulsory treatment in a specialized clinic. Only in 2011 did doctors conclude that Sara's condition did not pose a threat to society, so she was released. In 2020, earthly justice finally caught up with Asa Waldau herself, the charismatic founder of the religious community where this story began. The court found her guilty on 8 counts of attacks on former sect adherents. The woman got off with a relatively light punishment, community service. True, after her release, she had to change her last name, move to another city, and give up active religious activities. Daniel miraculously managed to survive after the brutal assassination attempt. Thanks to qualified medical care, the man slowly recovered from his injuries. However, he insisted that he would never return to Knutby. Daniel was frankly afraid of the local sectarians and did not want to have anything to do with this sinister church. Unfortunately, among the ministers of the community, another deranged sinner was found. Urban Filed, another pastor of the sect, was convicted of exploitation of women in a subordinate position. It turned out that for a long time he had been having relations with several parishioners, whom he falsely called his spiritual daughters. These unfortunate women were completely dependent on their abuser and unquestioningly obeyed all his perverse whims. I look forward to hearing your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. Until next time, friends.